This is Greg Orloff with IIoT World, and I'm here with Charlie Key, the CEO of Losant. Welcome, Charlie.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Pleasure to have you. The amount of uncertainty, Charlie, presented in 2020 is undeniably unprecedented, and it's catalyzed a massive acceleration towards digitalization globally across just about every industry vertical one can imagine. CEO of Microsoft said, Satya Nadella, we've seen 2 years of digital transformation in just about 2 months. But while the scale of the change is clear, the long-term impact is not. So with this in mind, Charlie, where do you see industrial IoT being leveraged by OEMs that perhaps it's not been so much in the past?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, 2020 certainly brought challenges throughout, all industries, and some of those have led to this digital transformation that we're seeing across a lot of sectors and industries that hadn't seen it. Everything from our schools, where our kids are going to school, they're now remote working, looking at a screen all the time, or trying to come up with different ways technology affects that. And then we go to the other side, where technology has always been part of their business in the industrial sector, and the question is now, how fast is that accelerating, and what's the long-term impact? When we look at what is happening with industrial OEMs and how they're thinking about their businesses, the shift has been there over the last couple of years. I think what we're seeing is the conversation in the internal strategies to be accelerated. If you think about understanding what's happening with their assets and resources and equipment that are out in the field, that are being sold, that are revenue generating, this has become a more important step for them to understand that in a remote sense, and understand that in a way that they can provide their customers and their internal stakeholders understanding of that equipment. And so, that story has grown over the last year, especially with the lockdown of travel, the reduction in workforces, and increased importance of understanding what's happening with our supply chains and our equipment. So, that story is driven largely into response of this pandemic. From our viewpoint, what we've seen is, as the pandemic took hold, nearly all companies took a pause to try to understand what they're looking at from an alignment of priorities, priority of budget, and their strategy. That strategy has changed over the year for sure. And over the course of the last 6 to 8 months, that strategy has been turned into some level of execution. And then as we roll into 2021 now, how does that get executed from both the budgetary standpoint and from a product alignment standpoint? So, that's kind of the process that we've seen. And I see a lot of these companies accelerating their digital priorities. And, that's going to take time. It still takes a lot of time in the industrial sector. It doesn't happen overnight. These companies are large, and these shifts take time, but it's accelerating.
No, absolutely. There's a lot of inertia, and correspondingly to the size of the organizations. So
yeah.
It's been interesting to watch it unfold. Some of them pivot and react immediately. Others take a little bit more time to process.
Right.
One of the other things we've noticed too, at least I want to see if you have, there seems to be a transition taking place in many sectors towards a preference of service versus more of a traditional CapEx, owner-operator model. In terms of software as a service, we're now seeing product as a service, or even quite literally machines and equipment as a service. Where do you see IoT being leveraged in these situations?
Yeah, this is definitely a trend that we're seeing, and we look at it from both sides of kind of the coin. If you think about it as a consumer of the equipment and of the products and the services, it allows you to continue to accelerate the quality, the turn of that innovation of that equipment that you are using. And if you think about manufacturing traditionally, you bought a machine, it lasted 30 years, maybe 40 years, if you continue to repair it and maintain it well. If you think about where we're headed to, is how do you enable manufacturers to shift that equipment to more of an as a service type of consumption that allows them to keep their equipment on a 3-year, 4-year, 5-year cycle. And so that's a big trend that we're starting to see. Again, if you look at small and mid-tier manufacturing, and especially in the US, it's again a transition, and that transition takes time. But you're starting to see that move. When you think about it from the other side, the equipment manufacturers and the OEMs, they're looking at it as multitude of ways. One is the revenue generation that they have as a service. If what's hot on the street today is as a service, and it allows you to build a recurring revenue, and that it differentiates their revenue streams and their product makeup. And so there's a lot of benefits to that. And IoT is a key ingredient to this overall story and this overall product, from the creators of these as a service, especially in the equipment space, and this allows them to add both the intelligence at the edge, so next to the piece of equipment, to bringing that data to a centralized location and allowing them to provide their internal service people with better capabilities to maintain and understand what's happening with the equipment. It allows their customers to have a better understanding in real time of the quality, the condition, and the long-term outlook of that equipment. And so all of these, IoT is a core ingredient to this. Now, there's a lot of other pieces that go with it as well, from process change to people training to understanding the business models. And so those things have to move in parallel, but IoT is a core ingredient of this transition that we're seeing.
No, it's fascinating. One of the things I was wondering too, are you seeing it any more in any particular industry?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and there's a couple of reasons in my mind of why we're seeing it in specific industries. So the key industries that we see it today are large, durable pieces of equipment. So you think about large engines, large compressors, pumps, pieces of equipment, all the way up to, Caterpillar with their giant pieces of machinery. But,
Right.
The core thesis in my mind here is you have to have an asset that has a certain amount of value, both from the value that it costs to produce it, to buy it, and the value of what it's producing on the other side. And so as that value increases, IoT becomes an easier story and an easier value add to produce that long-term ROI. And there's other components to that, from the hardware that it takes to actually, gather the data off of these pieces of equipment, to the connectivity, whatever connectivity you decide to use there, it incurs a cost. So, in my mind, and what we've seen is the larger the value of the equipment and the output of that equipment is where we're seeing a lot of the focus today. Now, in the long term, as the cost of connectivity comes down, the cost of compute, the cost of hardware, as that continues to drive down, we're going to see more and more industries on that long tail start to pick up IoT as a way to add value.
You touched on something, and I want to circle back to it as well. We see this constant conversation between edge, cloud, fog, all these different terms, right, that they're throwing out there. So where are you doing the crunching, right? Where's the computation going on? Are you seeing any shifts in that, as a result of this, to the points you mentioned, the cost?
Yeah, so we are seeing a shift. We're seeing a shift, especially in a lot of industries, but the industrial sector, especially as you think about, where the value of our data is, and how much of that data do we need to process in order to drive action, drive output, drive understanding. And so at the edge, we're seeing that amount get pushed up and get accelerated there, because if we can pull off data off of a piece of equipment, say it's a rotating piece of equipment, we can look at at vibration, we can look at all of these things in a higher frequency at the edge, be able to compute it in real time and make decisions there that we can't really financially do if we're going to do it in the cloud, just because the amount of data that we have to send up, the cost of transferring that information. And if it's in real time, the latency of that information is not going to be adequate in order to make a real-time decision on, say, a vibration, for instance. And so we're seeing a large shift to a lot more computing at that, I'll call it next to the piece of machine, whatever you want to call it, but next to the piece of machine, that compute is increasing as we need to be able to process more of that data in a faster time constraint in order to make these real-time decisions. And then we can take the aggregates, we can take multiple pieces of that data and then push it up to the cloud for additional processing.
You pointed something out. I think it's critical, and I want to just drive a little deeper as well. Folks in the C-suite, especially in the manufacturing sector, and a lot of these organizations, they're going to want some type of a business case or justification before they embark on one of these projects, at small scale, let alone macro scale. What type of best practices have you seen organizations leverage for gaining consent from the top?
Yeah, that's a great question. When I think about, first of all, I always start with kind of what's the goal in mind for these companies. And let's start from that endpoint and move our way backwards. And that endpoint should include what that ROI statement is, what that value is, what's our goal in building and solving these problems. So, we've got a problem, we've got a goal, and that ROI is part of that initial understanding. When we have those conversations, it's going to be a combination of, what are we monitoring? Let's put a value on that data. Let's put a value on the downtime of our equipment. Let's put a value on how often we have to replace and maintain, all the way to, we have customers who have, assets in extremely remote areas where the cost of remote monitoring for them includes a plane ticket, includes,
Sure.
a dozen times around the world. And so, all of these become part of that ROI statement for them and thinking about that long-term strategy about it. The other part of that is, what is the timeline for us to build that ROI up? When we start with one piece of equipment, to be honest, we're probably not break even on our return on investment, right? It's going to take an amount of ramp up from an equipment and from a timeline. And what we've seen, if I think about some of the pitfalls, what we've seen is, it basically an overestimation of how fast that's going to happen. It can be fast, but it's not going to happen day one. It's not going to happen day 30. If you turn it around in a year, that's pretty darn good. If we look at a return on investment over a 3-year period, that's probably more realistic of what we're going to expect to see. And even, in big projects, it might be a little bit longer. So in understanding of kind of that timeline that it's going to take to get that ROI that they're looking for.
I think that point is critical too, just from my own experience, is setting that expectation, right?
Absolutely.
We live in a now world, right? You order food now it's delivered to your house. You don't have to go out and get it, right? So, knowing that it's not going to be, this one pilot project is going to turn around and you're going to see an ROI in 3 months or 3 weeks.
Yeah, and I think that even becomes a more challenging, proposition when you look at companies that are on a public quarterly basis as well, and investing in long-term projects has become a little bit of a challenge in some of these organizations. Now, going back to that initial conversation, what the pandemic has done is it has added an understanding that we need to invest in ourselves in the long term. This is not only at a company or an enterprise or a corporation. This is at a country as a a global economy. We've seen a shift to a more diversified supply chain. I think you're going to continue to see a shift of more onshoring of manufacturing here in the U.S. Not 100%, but to diversify the supply chains that companies have. And so all of those are long-term investments. You're not going to turn that on overnight. And so if there's anything that from a mindset that we're going to see, that we're seeing come out of this really terrible global pandemic is a mindset that we have to invest in ourselves for the long term, both for the longevity of our economies, our countries, but also our enterprises and corporations.
No, excellent point. Excellent point. What words of wisdom or best practices can you share with organizations that are considering or already embarking on their own digital transformation? Any key facts or things that you would want to throw out there?
Yeah, there's a few areas, understanding what it takes to, and specifically, I'll talk a little bit about digital transformation in general, but also IoT. In the IoT world, right, when you think about what it takes for these companies to produce and bring to market a new product or a new service or a new solution in this area, you have the hardware, understanding what hardware that looks like. Even if you produce a large piece of equipment today, it's unlikely that you've probably interacted or built IoT hardware. You're likely going to have to get that from a third-party vendor. And so understanding what that looks like, understanding what the connectivity looks like. There's this stack that makes up what an IoT product and solution has to look like, and understanding the components that go into that and how you're not going to get it from one vendor. You're going to have a number of partners that are aligned and building out and going to market in a solution set. And so, taking a little bit of time up front to understand what that looks like. We're always a big fan of I say start small. And I don't mean start small as in something that only has a small ROI, but even if we're thinking about transforming a line of products, let's start with one product line. Let's start with, scaling that from 10 products to 1,000 products over the next year, 2 years, whatever that happens to be. We have to have a plan as we're looking at this over the long term. And again, overestimation of how quickly this can happen, temper those expectations a little bit. And those best practices and really thinking about that process goes a long way, and both at the business level, at the board level, because boards of these companies are walking in and saying, we've got to transform digitally. We've got to come up with new products and services. We've got to differentiate our revenue sources. And, that's not going to happen overnight, especially in this world today.
Very spot on. Well, thank you for joining us today, Charlie. We appreciate the time.
Greg, it was a pleasure, and I look forward to our next conversation.
I do as well. Take care.